Welcome to Lettres d'Amérique, a virtual series featuring essential American literary voices. I'm Alice McCrum, Programs Manager at the American Library in Paris. Bonjour et bienvenue à Lettres d'Amérique, une série virtuelle avec les nouvelles voix de la littérature américaine. Je suis Alice McCrum, responsable des programmes à la Bibliothèque américaine de Paris. Tonight, I have the pleasure of hosting Laila Lalami in conversation with Elizabeth Martin-Shukrun from the US Embassy to discuss Lalami's new work of nonfiction, Conditional Citizens. Here it is. I know Elizabeth has a copy as well. Now over to Laila and Elizabeth. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us this evening at Lettres d'Amérique. We are absolutely delighted to have and host you. Thank you both.
Alice, thank you so much. The embassy, the U.S. Embassy and the consulates here in France are really thrilled to be partnering with the American Library in Paris and with Festival America to bring you this sort of mini festival of American writers throughout the month of September. Lettres d'Amérique. We really developed this series as a way to highlight the works of a diverse set of American writers who offer very unique perspectives on the United States. Just before we got started talking, we were chatting, and as a diplomat, I work at the embassy. We move around every couple of years, and I haven't lived in my home country for many years, honestly. And so I found, as a voracious reader, that one way of connecting with my home country to the changes that are always happening is through books. It's not through that daily barrage of news updates, but it's really through reading and literature that I'm able to better connect with and understand the trends and the challenges, the innovations that are really shaping the United States today. And often there are very similar trends that are shaping France and French society, even when we deal with them in different ways. So the idea behind Lettres d'Amérique is really to spark a dialogue with readers in France, introduce some new American writers that perhaps you haven't read yet, and also get beyond the news a little bit to what's really going on in the United States. And that's why it's really such a pleasure to have with us today author Laila Lalami, who is based in California. She was born in Rabat and educated in Morocco, Great Britain, and the United States, and is author of 4 novels, including The Moor's Account, which won the American Book Award, as well as being a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Fiction. Her 2019 novel, The Other Americans, I've got that one right in front of me, was a bestseller in the United States and a finalist for the National Book Award in Fiction. And her essays and criticisms have appeared in numerous publications in the United States, Great Britain, and other countries. She's currently a professor of creative writing at the University of California in Riverside and lives in Los Angeles. And her new book, as Alice pointed out, is called Conditional Citizens and was just published last year. One thing before we start, I should clarify, our intention behind this series was to celebrate diverse perspectives on the United States, on American culture and society, and sometimes even American policy. I'm here as a reader, as someone who loves to read, and our discussion today is about literature. And so while we're very likely going to cover different aspects of American policy, we leave open to our writers to express their own opinions on anything. It doesn't mean that they represent the United States government in any way, shape, or form, and that's the point, is to encourage dialogue, to present different viewpoints. So we have not asked them to say anything, to say anything that represents our policy, and we know that you'll understand that anything that they say has to do with their own points of view. So with that, Laila, thank you so much for joining us. We're thrilled to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Elizabeth.
So we're going to talk about your writing, of course, but first of all, we gave that short introduction to your life. Can you just talk a little bit about, especially since a lot of your writing deals with issues of identity, could you just talk a little bit about your background and how you started on this path of becoming not only a writer, but an American writer writing in English?
Yes, it was quite a convoluted journey, and certainly one that I had not anticipated years ago when I began writing. So I was born and raised in Rabat, as you mentioned, in Morocco. It was a working class family, but one of the things that, and neither of my parents had gone to college, but one of the things that they loved to do was to read. They were both book lovers. And so I really grew up in a house full of books, surrounded by people who were reading. It was very natural to me that I did that from a very young age. And in fact, I don't remember a time when I was not reading. And so it was very natural that by like the age of 9, I had that urge to tell stories. And so write my own stories, kind of like what I was reading. And what's striking about that experience is that it happened in Morocco in the 1970s. And so although Morocco was already long independent from France by that point, the book market, at least what was available for sale at most of the major bookstores in Rabat, was really dominated by French books, particularly comic books, which is kind of like how you start to read as a child. And on top of that, my parents had put me in a French school. So it was, I really had a lot more exposure to French literature than I did to Arabic literature. So when I started writing, it was in French. And so this went on. I guess it's not that unusual in Morocco. There are plenty of Moroccan writers who write in Arabic and plenty who write in French. And it was not until I was in my 20s, when I was in college, I was in London, and, I majored in English and then later in linguistics, and, having to write research papers in English and live in an English speaking country. And there was constantly that shift between English and French every day. And that made me actually really reflect on the shift between Arabic and French that was happening every day, also back when I lived in Morocco. And it really made me realize how much of language in Morocco is tied to power, as it is in other societies. Nothing unusual about that. But in Morocco, it just happens to be that Moroccan Arabic is the language of the people and what you use at home. And then, of course, there's standard Arabic, which is what you hear on the news and, what you read in books. And then French is really the language of power. It's the language you would use, for example, if you're on a job interview, if you walk into a bank, if you have, any sort of a social situation that involves power differential, French is often used. And so then I started to then look at the kind of writing that I had been doing. And I just felt really this increasing discomfort with the kind of, I would say, like the colonial gaze on that writing. I kind of couldn't get it out of my mind. Like I would read it, and I would read it with the point of view of a French person, the point of view of a Moroccan person, and I felt very uncomfortable with that. So I kind of gave up on writing for a while. And then life moved on. I ended up doing a PhD. I moved to Los Angeles to do a PhD in linguistics and more research, more academic work in English. And it was at that point that I just missed writing, and I wanted to get back to it. And I thought, well, I could try to write in English, since it's a language that I speak and use in my research and speak every day. And for me, it was more of a neutral choice. I could kind of distance myself from that sort of power differential. And so that's how I started, in the 90s, I started writing fiction in English, and that led to the publication of my first book, which was in 2005.
It's incredible. I mean, it's true. Most of us would like to be able to publish a novel in any language, but then to just publish it in a language that was not your first mother tongue, if you will, is incredible. So I wanted to talk, before we get to your most recent book, a little bit about some of the older ones, particularly first about the Moors account. For those who haven't read it, it tells the story of a 16th century Spanish exploration of what's now the United States, but from the perspective of the first Black explorer of America, who was a Moroccan slave. And what's really astonishing about the book is that it's based on a real historic figure, right? And one of the things that struck me just about this book is that it strikes me that it's representative in some ways of this trend in the United States, this really important trend to revisit our history from a new perspective and to give voice to those who played roles in our history but haven't been memorialized in statues or in history books because of the color of their skin or their gender or their sex or their religion. So I'm curious, like, how did you come across this story, and why for you was it important to create this fictional memoir for the protagonist, for Mustafa or Estebanico?
Well, one of the things I want to say at the outset is that one of the things that I learned from the process of writing that book was how much of history really is an argument. It's something that is constantly reimagined and reinterpreted. And that is exactly what happened with this novel. I actually had no intention and frankly no interest in writing a historical novel. It wasn't a genre that I thought I would ever venture into. And what happened was that in the fall of 2009, I had been assigned a book, a political book to review. It was called Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, actually. And it was by a columnist for the Financial Times, Christopher Caldwell. And the book is basically a polemic on immigration, Muslim immigration to Europe, and how Europe is reacting to that. And so I, was assigned this book to review by The Nation magazine, which for those of you, for the readers who might not know, is actually the oldest continuously published magazine in the United States. It grew out of the abolitionist movement and is on, shall we say, the left-leaning side of the discourse. I seem to have disappeared. I made myself disappear. Did you see that?
Yes, you've gone into background mode. I think you've sort of become blurry.
Oh, hang on. Let me see. I'm going to try and fix that. Is it, maybe if I stop and restart my video?
There.
No, that is bizarre.
It blurred you, sort of like it's, yeah.
Maybe I touched my mouse and it did something.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
There you go. But now you're on mute.
I was about to seek technical help. That's why I muted myself. All right. So back to what we were saying. I'm not going to touch my desk again.
Hands up here.
But so anyway, I was assigned this book to review. And in the process of writing that review, I started doing some research into, the image that we have as modern peoples of immigrants. Like, what are the roots of those images? And that, one book led me to another. And I happened to read a book by a Moroccan scholar called We Are All Moors. The scholar is Anwar Majid at the University of New England. And halfway through that book, he casually mentions an enslaved man from Morocco who, my cat has this, an enslaved man from Morocco who becomes the first Black explorer of America. And I almost fell out of my chair. I thought, wait a minute, what? Who is this guy and why haven't I ever heard of him? Particularly because he was part of Cabeza de Vaca's journey to the United States. He was part of that expedition. And I had heard of Cabeza de Vaca. He's this incredible figure that they've made movies out of Cabeza de Vaca's journey. I mean, it was just this incredible expedition. And yet this guy who was part of that same expedition, I had never heard of. So I just became curious and I decided I would go straight to the source. And so I got Cabeza de Vaca's book that he wrote, which was published in Spain in 1542. And basically it tells the story of a Spanish expedition, the Narvaez expedition, which landed in Florida in 1528 with the goal of claiming it for the Spanish crown. But almost everything that could go wrong with that expedition went wrong. So there were mistakes in navigation, for example. They thought they were going one way, they were in fact going in the other. They met with resistance from indigenous tribes. They fell ill to things like cholera. They ran out of food. And so within a few months, they basically find themselves in the middle of Florida, lost. They have no idea which way to go back to find their ships. And so they decide to kill their horses and use them for food, and meanwhile build rafts just to escape out of Florida. But anyway, so there are only a few survivors to that expedition, including this explorer, this Black man, and they become the first outsiders to cross North America in 15. So this is, by this point, it's already the early 1530s. And I was just completely fascinated by this story of adventure. It's a story of transformation because the people who are coming to America to become conquerors in short order become conquered themselves. And it's a story of cross-cultural encounter. It's a story of, again, language and power and all those things. And I decided, as soon as I finished reading Cabeza de Vaca's book, I decided it would be really fascinating to retell that story from the perspective of this man, Mustafa, who the Spaniards called Estebanico. And because so little was known about him, I was able to basically fashion a whole novel using my own sort of imagination about who he might have been and how he ended up in a Spanish expedition and all of that. But then using also the facts of the expedition as we know them, the dates and where they were and how they got to where they were. And that is how the Moors account came about.
That's amazing. And I love how you said earlier that you started reading about him and thinking, how did I not know about this? And I feel like so much of, especially the last year in the United States, after the George Floyd killing and things, is people sort of saying, well, why don't we honor this figure, or why don't we know more about this person, and asking those questions, and whether through nonfiction or fiction, just growing our sense of history, like amplifying, or what's the word, making larger our sort of our lens on what our history really is, and it becomes richer that way.
Yeah.
So a lot of your novels, or you talked about how the Moors account is sort of sprung from your investigation or thinking about immigration. The Other Americans is one that I just read, which deals with the main character is first generation, born in the United States, but her family is from Morocco. And one of the things that struck me that I wanted to ask you about was this idea of the trauma of immigration and how, to a certain extent, that's passed down to children. So the parents in The Other Americans have this first trauma of leaving home, having to flee Morocco during political unrest, and then the sort of second trauma of leaving this comfortable life that they'd had and having to start over and being seen as an other in a new country, and having to do tasks that they thought that were beneath them and their level of education. And what struck me is how you see this immigrant experience from both perspectives, from the parent as well as a first generation child. And I'm curious, how has your own perception of immigration changed or not, or in culture and identity when you became a parent? Do you think your daughter, I understand you have a daughter, do you think she perceives her identity differently, or identity in general differently, than you did as a child, or than you do now?
Possibly, although I think her upbringing is so different than mine. I think what got me interested in this is this in writing The Other Americans is basically the kind of unintended consequences of immigrating. So even when you have a situation in which immigration is happening under the best of possible circumstances, right, where it's desired, where it's something that doesn't involve any kind of legal trouble or anything, like, so, which was my case essentially, because I came to the United States as a foreign student. I had no intention of being an immigrant. I ended up marrying an American, and that is how I became an immigrant. But even so, I think that a few years later, I began to see some of the effects of that decision. So for example, when there is a medical emergency, now I have to scramble and leave and try and get on a plane to travel to Morocco to be with my loved ones. And one of the things that happened during the pandemic is when we were all under quarantine, a lot of people for the first time experienced what it is like every day for immigrants, which is that you are not able to visit your family when and how you feel like it. It is completely up to circumstance whether you are able to see them or not. And some people, I mean, I've been fortunate that I could see them on a regular basis, but there are people who go on for years without seeing their loved ones. And I think another unintended consequence is what happens with the children. And this is, I started noticing this when my daughter started school. And how I started noticing it was every time we had things like a recital, like a concert recital, or like school performance or like anything theatrical, anything having to do with, your family comes to school to watch the kid perform, or, and everybody else has like grandparents. And my daughter didn't have her grandparents there. And this happened. And she's never complained about it. She's never said, how come, so-and-so has, a family of 6 that's showing up and I don't. She's never complained about that. But it is something that I noticed. And so in the writing of this book, I began to think about what that decision means for the next generation, and to kind of grow that into the story of a family that is brought together by the death of the father. And it brings up all these questions about what happened years ago. So I guess in a way you could say it's also another novel about history. It's also another novel that asks about the effect of something that happened many years earlier, except in this case, it's in the canvas of the family as opposed to like larger historical events.
It's if you allow me to transition with the history a little bit, because the Other Americans takes place in a post 9/11 world, and the characters are affected by sort of by anti-Arab sentiments post 9/11. It's something that you also address in Conditional Citizens, is this sort of post 9/11 world. I'm wondering, we're almost just a few days away actually from the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and I'm wondering if you would mind sort of sharing a little bit your own sort of experience with this, and especially, and have you seen anything? I mean, one of the things that's come to my mind over the last year or so is this rise in anti-Asian hatred that we've seen in COVID times, not just in the United States, unfortunately. And this sort of repetition that it keeps coming to always try to sort of blame the other in times of crisis. I'm wondering if you could comment on that a little bit, sort of your experience being an American, but an immigrant American post 9/11, and then how that sort of shaped your concept of this conditional citizenship.
It's interesting because earlier when we were in the green room, we were talking about, I'm on deadline. I'm actually writing an essay about this right now. Yeah. But basically I do, I remember very well, the event and the feeling that it was the kind of moment where you realize within seconds that this is going to be a historically significant moment that's going to split time. There's going to be a before and an after. So we all knew it like that day when it happened. And in September 2001, I was actually, I was working for a software startup company. I was working as a linguist. I was writing, but I was not yet published. And I mean, I remember, not just the day, but I remember everything else that happened after. And particularly, as you say, the rise of this sentiment, which anti-Muslim and anti-Arab sentiment. One of the things that happened is that George W. Bush, who was at the time the president of the United States, went to great lengths to make to make it clear that there was a difference between the 19 terrorists who committed those attacks and the rest of the Muslim world. So in fact, polls showed that while definitely there was a spike, in fact, of hate crimes against Muslims, the general public opinion of Muslims was actually improved in the year after 9/11. And then it was only 2 years later that it started going into disapproval. And what that suggests is that, yes, there were these hate crimes. There was a kind of like politicization of those events and a number of people who were using them for political reasons. Like, so there's a number of people, for example, there was the controversy over the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, which is basically this cultural center that was supposed to be a few blocks from where Ground Zero was. And there was this huge controversy that lasted for weeks. And that's the kind of controversy that leads to a spike of anti-Muslim sentiment and a spike in hate events. So for me, it's both like a historical moment. It's a personal moment because I know, I've been the recipient of some unsavory comments myself about 9/11, and I knew people who were affected by it. I had a friend who was a graduate student who had to be subjected to special registration with INS, which is a program that was started after 9/11, where people from majority Muslim countries, whether immigrants or foreign students, had to register with INS. It was a special registration of Muslims. I had a friend who was attacked on the street after 9/11. So, so there's that, and then there's the event itself, and then there's everything else that happened in the 20 years since, not just the wars, but how America has kind of thought of itself as a country. So traditionally, like the United States thinks of itself as a nation of immigrants, but as you mentioned, for example, with the anti-Asian attacks of this last summer, what we see oftentimes is that the citizenship of non-white people in the United States is really conditional, meaning that in moments of great distress or national distress, oftentimes their belonging comes into question. So during the pandemic, it happened against Asian Americans. So they were basically subjected to hate speech, physical attacks, collective blaming for something that they had nothing to do with because it's a pandemic, and association with the communist government of China, of which they have no part. So all of those to me are suggestive of conditional citizenship. And in the book, I basically, which was published before the pandemic, which was written before the pandemic, I talk mostly about how that has affected people who are Arab and Muslim. So, for example, in the United States, you have people like Congresswoman Ilhan Omar or Rashidat Tlaib, who are both of them members of Congress from Minnesota and Michigan, respectively. And they, if they say something that is critical of foreign policy, you have people who are at the highest levels of government that basically tell them, go back to where you came from. So this is something that happens regardless of the person's position within society, which is this sense that your belonging is up for question when you are a non-white citizen of the United States. If that makes sense. I feel like I've been rambling a bit.
No, it's interesting, and again, it's one of these things that I think, how do we deal with as a nation these and again, unfortunately, not just the United States, but many other countries, this sort of sense of something that happens and then a reaction where you're looking to place blame, and how do we address that, and the way that marginalizes people who are citizens, and yet, like you say, they're being somehow it's calling into question whether they're really citizens. One of the things that I appreciated about the other Americans, but that you also seemed to were in the other Americans, I felt like you were exploring it in a fictional way, and then Conditional Citizens in a non-fictional essay kind of way, was this idea of what love of country is in some ways. What you start the essay in Conditional Citizens saying this is a story about love and country, but it also seemed to be talking about love of country. And I felt like, I'm not going to give away the end of the other Americans for those who haven't read it yet, but there is a love story involved in it as well. And the sense that I got from both books was you in some ways making a very, very strong case that if you want to be a citizen who loves their country, that it's your obligation to look at it critically, and to be honest with it, and to engage, like you were saying, sort of in argument and things. Is that a fair interpretation of those books in some ways? Or?
I mean, it's definitely a fair interpretation of the essay collection. I think what's really amusing to me, I think particularly as an immigrant, is that I have often noticed, for example, if I write critically about the United States, my readers, for example, in Morocco, which is where I'm from, don't have a problem with that. It's like, fine, criticize. But if I write critically about Morocco, my readers in Morocco is like, well, you sit in Los Angeles and you tell us these things, so there's a bit of defensiveness and vice versa, meaning that if I write about Morocco, I receive emails critically about Morocco. I receive emails that say, and I'm not kidding, that I am speaking truth to power. But if I write critically about the United States, I get hate mail from Americans saying, how dare you? You should be grateful that you're an immigrant to this country. So I think that how readers respond to criticism is, to me, something that I have, as a writer, I've had to sort of dissociate from, just because I'm the same person. I'm casting the exact same eye on, I hope, the same eye on both countries. And so I just happen to write things how I see them, but the reaction can be very different whether I'm writing critically about a place or not critically about, or writing critically about another place. And I think it's always easier to accept criticism when it is directed against someone or somewhere else. And I think it's much harder to accept criticism when it is turned inward. So to a certain extent, I completely understand that. And I think it's particularly, I think with this book, it's particularly, that was basically the lesson for me when I wrote this book, is getting to hear, people who say, wow, I didn't know some of these things about US history, and this is great. But then also hearing from other people saying, oh my God, how dare you, and you're being entirely too harsh, or too pessimistic about the country. But I think that, and one of the things that this book articulates, is that criticism is an act of love. Because if a person doesn't care about something, why would they even bother to engage critically with it? When you engage critically with something, it's because you want it to be better. And I think that that is an act of love. With the other Americans, for me, as a writer, it's a completely different project, because in writing a novel, so in writing the essays, there is a certain amount of trying to build an argument, and in a sense, trying to convince a reader of something. But with the other Americans, in building a story and in inhabiting points of view with which I do not agree with, it's more of like building a story and letting the readers decide for themselves how they view the country based on what they see in that book. So it's a completely different approach. One is more, I would say, rhetorical, and the other one is more it's fiction. So it's asking you to, it's more emotional. It's asking you to inhabit these different voices in the novel, and to look at the community that emerges, or the vision of the community that emerges, and is asking you to consider the place that each of these people has in it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I love the way that it's the purpose for both the purpose and then the form that those different forms of writing take. I'm just going to ask you one more question, and then I'll stop, and I'm going to open it up to, I'm going to give it back to Alice and open it up to our listeners and our viewers today. So if you have some questions, start putting them in. One of the things that you point out in Conditional Citizens is this inconsistency in American attitudes towards immigrants. At the same time, we like to call ourselves as the nation of immigrants, America's best hope, and then also this idea of the gravest threat to the United States. And you gave some really interesting historical examples in the book about discrimination against waves of immigrants, Catholics from Ireland, for example, and how these tend to be forgotten as they go down the line. So descendants of those Irish immigrants are now critical of newer groups for not assimilating, right? Yeah. But at the same time, it's an interesting moment. We're looking at the 2020 census data from the United States, and different from France, we actually collect information in the census to have an idea of people's religious identity, ethnicity, and others. And we see that the latest census data shows that people of color represent at least 43% of the population. Do you see this changing? Do you see American attitudes with a larger and larger number of people in the country who are not this who don't look like me, who represent
me.
this diversity of America. Do you see this changing? Do you have hope that we're going to be able to break this cycle in some way?
I mean, I have to have hope only because I live in this country and I get up every day and I want it to be a comfortable place for all of us, and a just place for all of us. What's going to happen, honestly, is going to depend on who has power within our political arena, more so than on the sort of composition of our demographics. So it is true that the United States is now a more diverse country than it was 30 years ago. But the United States was never not a diverse country from its founding, because it was, first of all, it was a place that already had people in it by the time the pilgrims arrived. It was, it had indigenous people, and they themselves had their own diversity. The pilgrims arrived, then of course enslaved people are brought from different parts of the world. And so this country was always a diverse country, but it was not a nation of immigrants, even though the United States promotes that view to the rest of the world, particularly through its symbols, like the Statue of Liberty in New York, which is something that has given hope to so many people. And this idea that there is a country where no matter where you come from, you can be part of the whole. The reality is that the United States has very carefully controlled its immigration throughout its history. And not everybody could just come and show up and be taken in at Ellis Island, for example. So there are different laws that were passed, like, for example, Chinese exclusion, Mexican repatriation, and so on and so forth. Or the Immigration Act of 1924, which essentially closed immigration to all but non-whites. So really, it was not until 1965 that considerations of race stopped being used in allowing immigrants to come to the United States. And now, within 50 years, we see the results of that opening, where the United States now, for the first time, is going to become a country in which different racial groups are there's not going to be a majority white nation. It's going to be a country of diverse racial groups. The great thing about that is that it's forever dissociating the idea of citizenship from the concept of race. And so citizenship is essentially a political community, right? It's a community of people who share the same political goals. But whether that's so demographically, of course, the United States is completely transformed in the last 50 years and in the next 50 years. But there are also, again, we go back to the idea of history. There are certain things in our history that hold us back. The way in which our political system is built does not give equal power to everybody within the United States. There are many examples of that, but the most basic one is the Electoral College. So you have a system in which the Electoral College decides who is going to become president. And that system gives a certain amount of power to states that are relatively less populated than California. So, for example, California has 40 million people, but it's going to have the same number of senators as Wyoming, which has 500,000 people. So even if you have more diverse states, it does not necessarily mean that we're going to have a more diverse or a more complicated form of government, because we are being held back by that older history from the founding of the nation about how the United States should be governed. So I think the challenge is, in the next 50 years, how do we get this diverse nation to be a more just nation politically, so that people have an equal voice in how their government is ruling them. Right now, I don't think we're there yet. It's not a system that does that. And I think that what's incredible about it is that culturally, the United States is light years ahead of where it is politically. In other words, you can have these incredible conversations on the national stage about how diverse the United States is, or about all these different issues, because as you said, we do keep track of individual citizens by race and by gender and by age. So we have a very accurate picture of the country and its diversity. But what we don't have yet is a reform of the system, because we're living with the system. So how do we reform it in a way that gives equal voice to everybody within the country?
Great, thank you. I love your cat too. She or he has been.
He tried to sit on my lap and then.
He's totally trying to upstage you. So with that, I'll maybe turn it over. Alice, so do we have some questions in the chat that you'd like to pose to the?
Hi, yes, lovely. We just received one. Well, first of all, Elizabeth, thank you very much for your wonderful questions. You've now disappeared, but I know you're still there. Thank you.
I'm here and I have more if we need them. So.
Great. Thank you so much for your thoughtful participation and consideration. Thank you again to Leila for being here. If you arrived a bit late, you've stumbled in on a conversation between Elizabeth Martin-Shukrun and Laila Lalami to discuss Leila's new work of nonfiction, Conditional Citizens. We should all definitely hold it up at the end and round in pride. We're now moving to the part of tonight's event, which is a conversation as part of an ongoing series called Lettres hosted by the American Library in Paris, the US Embassy, Festival America, and Transfuge magazine. And we're going to get to your questions and comments, so please go ahead and post them in the chat. Leila, a first question from Mehdi, who would like to know when Conditional Citizens might be translated into French and published in French.
I don't know.
Only because there are so many people they want to offer it to.
I don't know. I think it's interesting because each book has had varying levels of success in translation. So for example, my first book was translated into French, Hope and Other Dangerous Pursuits. The one that was published in 2005 was translated into French, but not Secret Sun, which was published in 2009, not The Moor's Account, which was astonishing to me because it's such a book that, it really is about this explorer from Morocco who gets swept up in this European expedition to what is now the United States. So I thought that book would be translated into French, and it hasn't, but it's been translated in other European languages. And then The Other Americans is translated into French, but not Conditional Citizens. And so the way that it works is that the books are sent out to publishers, and the publishers get to decide what they're interested in translating and what they're not. And for some reason, there has not yet been interest in Conditional Citizens. So I'm sorry, I don't know when or if it will be translated.
Do you have a sense, you talked about the reception of your work in the US and Morocco. Do you have a sense of how your work is received in France?
I was going to, because I was supposed to visit France in 2020 as part of the Festival America was what it was called. And I was supposed to arrive in France, and it was going, the publication of The Other Americans in French. And that was going to be the first time that I would get a sense of it, and or the second time really, because I had another book translated in French. But of course, the pandemic canceled all of this. So I don't get a sense of it really. And I think it's because I write in English, and I don't really comment on French politics outside of my occasional tweet here and there. But it's not a country that I, give talks in that much. And so I don't really know how the work is received. I do know that my last book was published there. It's also coming out in paperback next year there. So I guess it must have done well enough, but not beyond that. I don't know.
Well, as we say to everyone who's joined us on Zoom, this is just a placeholder for when you do next kind of come over to Europe or indeed France.
I hope so.
Certainly you're welcome and very much invited to speak at the library, and hopefully Elizabeth will still be in Paris. She hasn't moved on to her next destination. So we'll look forward to that when that happens. We have a question from Inez, who says, hello, Leila. Do you think we are determined, entre guillemets, from birth by the accidents of birth you mentioned? How much autonomy do you think we have when deciding the kind of life we want?
This is the deep philosophical question of nature versus nurture.
Well, yes.
And I shall answer it all.
And now you're going to give us the answer right now. We've been waiting for years.
I think most of us don't realize how much is actually decided for us by accidents of birth. I think one of the things in writing this book and writing a book about citizenship has made me realize, since citizenship is an accident of birth, but a lot of the rights and freedoms that you enjoy every day are determined by that accident of birth. So if you are born in North Korea, for example, you do not have freedom of movement. If you're born in Gaza, you do not have freedom of movement. You can't just pick up and say, oh, I feel like traveling to Paris for 2 weeks on vacation. You can't do that. You do not have that freedom of movement. But if you're, and if you're born in the States, you have the right to vote in an election. That might not be the case if you're in North Korea or some other countries. So a lot of the rights and liberties that we associate with citizenship are determined completely by accident of birth. Whether you're a man or a woman can make a huge difference in your access to rights around the world, to your bodily autonomy, to your bodily integrity, as we see what's happening now in Texas. So I think that we often underestimate how much of that is actually outside of our control. However, having said that, just complete interruptions all the time.
Just invite the whole family, and we'd love to meet everyone.
But having said that, yes, you do. A set of rights and freedoms are determined by accidents of birth, but that's on the macro level. But on the micro level, like the choices that you make every day, of course, those choices belong to you. And those choices also determine the kind of life that you choose to live. You can have a life in which you decide to protest the establishment, or you can have the kind of life where you choose to go along with the establishment. And those are going to be two very different lives. So I do think that, yes, of course, your personal choices do affect your journey on this planet. And it is a journey where everything is ephemeral in this life. So yes, I think it's a bit of both. So there, I've solved your philosophical question.
Thank you so much. We can all breathe a deep sigh of relief. We have a question from Mohammed, who I believe writes from Morocco, Larache. They say, hello, our beloved writer. Don't you think that this battle or struggle for inclusion is heading towards what Malouf talks about in his book, In the Name of Identity, in brackets, I mean heading towards racial, religious, gender, tribalism, and all the struggles that brings?
I mean, I think that is the danger that a lot of people, that's something that a lot of people are worried about, right? Like with the rise of different groups asking for greater rights, does that mean that identity politics is now ruling everything, and that we are nothing more than, a set of boxes, and we check those boxes? Well, I happen to think that, of course, identity is a lot more than a set of boxes. Identity is very complex. And one of the things that it's not fixed. Our identities change. Our identities can change within the course of a lifetime. You can identify as one thing 1 year, and then 2 years later, now you identify as something else. And I think thinking of it as purely a question of identity politics that's leading to tribalism is actually kind of, glossing over the fact that identity politics existed long before the rise of this new civil rights movement. It's just that because it was the identity of the majority group, i.e. mostly white, mostly men, mostly wealthy property owners, if you will, that we didn't think of it as identity politics. But in fact, it was its own identity politics. It's just that people didn't think about it. But now that everybody's claiming their little identity within that group, then there's a lot of anxiety around it. There is some danger in that, but I do think that our identities are more complex than just a set of boxes. And I think that how you see them expressed is more than what you see online, or more than what you see with the rise of social media and sort of clapbacks and all this, like, sort of like superficial debates. I think it's actually a lot more fluid and a lot more complex, and involves a lot more solidarity than people are willing to give it.
Right. No, I was gonna ask you how you thought the form of social media and online kind of discussions about this topic maybe kind of did the, as you say, the pluralism of identity a huge disservice.
I do, because I think that, unfortunately, because social media depends so often on outrage, it also means that it depends on misunderstanding. And some of that is willful misunderstanding of what other people are saying. So when somebody is asking for greater recognition of themselves, that does not mean that they are asking for you to be less recognized. But I think that oftentimes in social media, the way that things get expressed in these sort of sometimes pithy ways, but oftentimes also just extremely ungenerous and extremely, as I said, willfully misunderstanding what others are saying, I think it can frame the debate in extremely narrow ways. And if you step outside of, social media, Twitter and all of that, you can see that people have more fluid understanding of their lives and more fluid understanding of events around them. And I'm thinking in particular of how in the last election, for example, if you just think that everything is identity politics, you would think that one candidate would get the sort of like racial minorities vote and the other candidate would get the mostly white vote. So that would be in the last presidential election. And that's not necessarily what happened. While yes, it's true that one candidate got more of the racial minority vote, I mean, a number of, for example, Hispanic voters went the other way. And so how do you explain that if you think that everything is identity? You can't explain it. People's identities are fluid and they respond to different issues in different ways. And so maybe that candidate appealed to them because of other parts of their identity, including, for example, how they viewed politics in, say, for example, South America, or how they view the rise of so-called socialism. They might vote differently because of that. And so you can't just assume that you're going to get that kind of group vote. People are not monoliths, in no place are they monoliths. So.
Lovely, thank you. Your thoughts on nature versus nurture, and now your thoughts on identity politics. Just get the next big topic. In fact, this is a very big topic, and Crystal would like to know, Leila, what do you think about the situation of emigration and refugee status from Afghanistan?
Well, I have been watching the news the last few weeks, and I should say at the outset that after September 11th, I was actually against the war in Afghanistan because I had remembered living through the Soviet invasion and later occupation of Afghanistan, and also its ignominious end. So I thought, what makes the United States think that it's going to succeed where another major empire has fallen and other empires have fallen before? And it wasn't clear to me what the end goal was, and so I oftentimes would see, each new milestone being reached, like, for example, the offer of the Taliban to surrender in December 2001, or the capture or the death of the killing of Osama bin Laden, and think, okay, maybe now the wars are going to stop, and yet the wars continued. So, I was very much in support of the withdrawal in Afghanistan because I was against the war from the beginning, but also it really filled me with sadness because I could see just history repeating itself in a way, because all the people that these promises had been made to were being left behind, and the United States was leaving in such a rush without evacuating all the people that wanted to leave. And so it was incredible to me too to watch the people who were the politicians who were most in favor of keeping the war and keeping the US forces there were also the same politicians who were against raising the refugee cap in the United States, or against changing immigration laws to allow people to more swiftly apply for citizenship. So it's just this weird, dichotomy in US politics where there's this this idea that you can go to war in another country, but at the same time refuse to take the refugees from that war. So it was just watching everything that was happening. It was like watching a repeat of what had happened to other immigrants before, to other refugees rather, from other wars, like in Vietnam and elsewhere. I do hope that the United States takes in more refugees, and that the ones that it has taken, that it makes it easier for them to apply for asylum, because just the fact that they've arrived here does not mean that they're going to get to stay here. Right now they're at army installations, and they're not necessarily yet allowed to continue on with their lives. So, you know, I look at it as all just a sort of bittersweet moment, like basically feeling relief that the US has finally withdrawn from its forces, its ground forces anyway, from Afghanistan, but at the same time, this deep concern for what is going to happen to refugees and the people who are left behind.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to thank you for your kind of, I suppose, judgments about all of these enormous topics. I think it's fitting because, you know, this book, Conditional Citizens, here it is again, it's your first book of nonfiction, right? And you said in an interview that you kind of described the process of writing fiction as the process in some ways of withholding judgment, and this was the first book which you found yourself kind of inserting judgment onto the page. You described feeling much more present and kind of visible on the page. I wonder if you could just speak a little bit, since we are kind of at the end of tonight's conversation, how did it feel feeling more present on the page, and how has the response been in result?
It's something that I felt was needed in order to inform the reader about the sort of perspective that these essays are coming from. Like, in order for you to understand how, you know, I'm building this argument, you have to understand who I am and how I came to those conclusions. But that process is not, I don't find particularly pleasurable, because in spite of the fact that I'm a public person, I tend to be intensely private. And so it has been very difficult writing about these private things in this book. I think that for me, fiction is a much more comfortable canvas, because I can write about these different characters, and I can at will use my imagination. I can use parts of my life experience, but I don't have to. I can do whatever I want with it. So it's a much more sort of a space of freedom for me than it is in writing essays, which I prefer to do on a more intellectual basis than on a personal basis. But I felt like with this particular book, I felt like it was necessary to include those sort of personal touches.
And has it elicited a different response?
It's been interesting. I think you know, I don't read reviews, but I do. I stopped.
But you stopped. When did you stop?
I stopped back in 2000, like 5 or 6 years ago after
Really?
my book. I did. I stopped. I felt that I felt that reviews are for readers. They're not really for me. They're for readers, and it's a conversation between the critic and readers, and that it really wasn't necessarily helping me as a writer to hear what the reviewers were saying, because it was too late. I can't change that book. And I need to really stay focused on the book that I'm writing on at the moment, not the one that has already been published. But having said that, I do have social media accounts. So sometimes I do hear from people, even if I don't necessarily want to hear someone's opinion, I will hear it. So I think that with this one, it was a bit more unusual for me, because it really, people are reacting to it as a reaction to me a little bit. So it's a little bit different than writing novels, which are more about your craft and your imagination, hopefully. So it was a bit of a different experience. Okay. And also it's different in the sense that it really involves real life events. So people have their own memories of it, their own experiences of it, their own views of it. So it's a lot more argumentative. Whereas with a novel, it's like, well, if you're not interested in reading this novel, then you just don't read it. But this one, it's, well, I remember these events and here's my take on them and I'll tell you. So it's a different reaction.